Hello and welcome. My name is Maggie Grabmeyer. I'm an adult services librarian here at the Mill Valley Public Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program with Emily Galvin Almanza and Nell Bernstein. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the occupied territory of the Coast Miwok people. I'd like to express gratitude for the Coast Miwok people and encourage you all to find out how to get involved and learn more about the indigenous people in Marin County by checking out coastmiwokofmarin.org. I want to shout out our bookseller partner, the Friends of the Mill Valley Library Bookstore, over there in the corner. After the program, they will be selling books, and both Emily and Nell will have time for a brief signing, so we'll hope you'll consider buying a book. If you're interested in learning about our upcoming library programs, I encourage you to grab a brochure from the table over there or check out our calendar on our website, millvalleylibrary.gov. Now, onto the program. Emily Galvin Almanza is the co-founder and executive director of Partners for Justice, a nonprofit creating a new collaborative model designed to empower public defenders nationwide. Prior to founding PFJ, Emily fought for clients inside the LA County Public Defender, Santa Clara County Public Defender, and Bronx Defenders, and with the Stanford Three Strikes Project. Her new book, The Price of Mercy, weaves hard data and unforgettable stories, dark humor, and compelling evidence to tell us the truth about what's really going on behind the closed doors of America's criminal courts. The book argues that we need an engaged public to confront the stark reality of our legal apparatus and rebuild it into something that can save our collective present and prevent our future from being torn apart. Tonight's moderator is author Nell Bernstein. Nell is a former Soros Justice Media Fellow in New York and winner of a White House Champion of Change Award. She's the author of In Our Future, We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison, and Burning Down the House, The End of Juvenile Prison. Please join me in welcoming Emily Galvin Almanza and Nell Bernstein.
Thank you. I'm really glad to see a full room because I think this is a book that everyone should read. I felt as I was reading it that it should be assigned in every high school in the US Gov class. It sort of takes you on a walk through this system that we're all subject to, that we vote for, that we pay for, that we're asked to participate in when we get a jury duty notice. And it's a system that I've been writing about for 20 years, but I was really confronted with my own ignorance reading the book. There are just so many insane things in it. And what I loved about the book was that it wasn't a treatise. You're kind of walking us through this world as a public defender. And I wanted to ask you first about that. I think public defenders have invisible halos. I think to go to law school, take out debt, and then take on this caseload and this, in a good way. So I just wanted to ask you first about why you became a public defender and what it was like. We'll talk about some of the specifics later, but what it was like to walk beside people through this kind of crushing system that you describe.
That's a really beautiful question. Thank you for that question.
Okay, we're off to a good start.
Yeah. I mean, tell people they got invisible halos. You're definitely off to a good start. Well, before I was a public defender, I was a kid who needed to be defended. And I tell the story a little bit in the book, but the bottom line of it is, by the time I walked into law school, I was only walking into law school because I had had an incredibly great judge in my case who looked at me and saw potential instead of threat. And obviously there's a lot of other forms of privilege involved in how I moved through the criminal court space. But I don't want to take away from the incredible gift that this judge gave me. A judge who was a legendary advocate for kids, one of the only black judges in a time in Boston when he was routinely not treated like a judge when he walked into courthouses. And who had made it his mission to try to save every kid who came through his courtroom. And so because of him, I was able to go to college, I was able to go to law school. I was going through a really hard time. I was not a very introspective teenager at that point. And by the time I got to law school, I thought, I really connect with these criminal law cases. I'm not gonna think too hard about why. I remember the facts so well, better than criminal procedure. And I got a job at the LA County Public Defender because I thought I connect with the subject matter and I would never want to accidentally put an innocent person in prison, so I'd better go to the side of liberation. And my first assignment at the LA County Public Defender, my 1L summer, was Eastlake Juvenile Courthouse, which is the busiest juvenile courthouse in LA. And as soon as I got there, I found myself walking into rooms with kids who had done stuff that I had literally done just a few years before, except for that they were black and brown in East LA, and I had not been. And so for me, that kind of burning dichotomy of what I had experienced, what they were experiencing, what the system is capable of in terms of giving grace, and what it denies almost everyone who sets foot in it, kept me in this work permanently. It is an incredible honor to meet a stranger and to have them entrust you with their story and with their crisis and with their future. It is an incredible honor to be able to try to take what you are given from someone and show it to somebody else. Because the criminal legal system is just a bunch of humans in rooms, guys. Like, it's just people doing people stuff. So most of what my job is convincing one person, whether it's a judge or a prosecutor, that this other person is full of promise, is worthy, is not a threat, is someone whose future should be important to us. And to not just do that once, but to do it again and again and again and again, often back to back to back to back to back, trying to make sure that each person's narrative and truth is different enough from the last person that I can get that level of care and attention again and again and again until I've represented at this point over 2,000 people. There is no job I'd rather have. I miss it terribly. My job now is enhancing public defense around the country and helping public defender agencies do broader work. And I can tell you how much I miss like standing up in arraignment court and fighting for futures and talking to jurors. There's nothing better. It's really unique to live in a country that believes in the truth-finding ability of groups of strangers. And to be a messenger in that system is the greatest gift of my life.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you to go a little darker now. That was a really beautiful testimony to the work of the public defender. What I enjoyed about the book was how granular it was, the way that you wove the stories of some of your clients into your observations about larger issues. Because I think when we think about crime and courtrooms, and maybe this isn't true of the folks who came out tonight, we think of, murders and rapes and kidnappings and big dramatic courtroom scenes, but you describe a woman named Nell who you just took us through her whole case, and it's a crazy making story. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about this one client and
What happened?
what happened. Yeah.
It's still making me crazy. And to be clear, I told the stories of my clients in collaboration with them. So I want everyone to be clear that this was a joint effort of sharing stories, not something that I took upon myself to repurpose for my own ends. But Janelle's story is crazy making because she lost everything for no reason. Janelle was living in the Bronx, working for the New York Department of Education. And one day she woke up and her car was gone. And she'd been behind on the payments, so she thought maybe the car got repossessed. So she called the bank, and she called tow lots, and she called repo people, and she couldn't find her car. At one point, we thought it was with something called phantom towing, but that turned out to be a phantom tow yard. She went there, and her car wasn't there. She had tried to report this to the police, but the NYPD had done nothing. They literally didn't even show up. And the insurance folks needed a police report to be able to process her claim. And so after days of this going on and her not having the right paperwork and being in bureaucratic hell, at one point, one of the customer service reps she was talking to on the phone said, look, just tell the police that the car was stolen today, and that way they'll think, they'll come right away. Just change the date. So she did. And that one misrepresentation on a form gave rise to a felony insurance fraud case because, unbeknownst to her, her car had actually been found 3 days prior, burned out in Baltimore. So now, on the basis of, there's no other evidence, right? There's no like car theft ring saying she's the mastermind. There's nothing, there's a wrong date on a form. That's what there is. On the basis of that alone, the Bronx DA's office decided that Janelle was the mastermind of this insurance fraud scheme, and they prosecuted her to the fullest extent of the law. She was immediately suspended from her job at the Department of Education. And many people think that a case like that will resolve, like you go into court, you take it in front of a judge, it's decided. But instead, in a jurisdiction where there are so many cases clogging the courts, her case dragged on for years. And again, she had to find her way to court, get transportation, make sure she was going while her youngest kid was in school, sit there all day, be treated like a criminal. Sitting in the courtroom, if you're out of custody, which is so much better than being in custody, still you're dragged to a place where everybody treats you like you're garbage, and you have to sit there at attention in the courtroom and not look at your phone and not read and not do any work, not do anything, until you're called up to the well. And then nothing happens in your case because the prosecutor hasn't handed over some evidence yet, or a motion has been filed but not responded to, or the courtroom's just too busy that day. And again, her case got kicked down the road. When I finally got her case, it had been, I think, well over 18 months at that point. And what we needed to do was get the transcript of the call with the customer service person to prove to the DA that she wasn't a mastermind. A customer service person gave her some bad advice. She did it, and it was just a dumb mistake. When we finally got the transcript, I showed it to the prosecutor, but she didn't have permission from her boss to dismiss the charges. It took us more months and months and months and months for her to convince her boss, because some DA's offices just don't do dismissals because they never get it wrong. And when you have a no dismissal policy, these things drag forever. By the time we finally got Janelle's dismissal, she had been let go from the Department of Education. And by the time, years later, that I was interviewing her for this book, she still didn't have her job back. During the case, she had started drinking. At one point, she had thought about taking her own life. She goes up for jobs again and again and again, but the arrest is still on her record. So there have been times when she's almost had a DOE job, and then they see the arrest and they take it back.
Many things struck me about this story, but one of the things that struck me was that this was a victory. You kept her from being convicted. And, we talk a lot about the collateral consequences of incarceration, but these are the collateral consequences of being charged. And when I told you earlier that there were many things that I just didn't understand, that was one of them. But there's also, when you tell a story like that, and there's a lot of them in the book, kind of a human mystery for me that I want to ask you about. Because, you've got all of these, maybe it's a question of good and evil. I don't know. I'm just going to start with the easy ones. All of these agents of justice, police, prosecutors, judges, parole officers, who in a lot of the stories you tell seem very willing to just grind people into dust, as you describe with Janelle. And, in my interactions with mostly prison guards, they're not bad people. And one thing you wrote that really stood out to me is it's about bad incentives, not bad people. But there's still something I don't understand that I'd like you to try to explain about how people act as cogs in a system with such devastating outcomes and so little to offer in terms of public safety. That's a leading question.
Yeah, it's not my intent to demonize anyone. I mean,
so maybe it's the system we need to understand.
There's some people. There's some people. But in Janelle's case, she was up against a prosecutor agency that really, really incentivized convictions to the point where they had an essentially no dismissal policy. The best one could ever hope to get was something called an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, which is where it's like you stay out of trouble for 6 months and then there's a dismissal. But the thing is, that's a negotiated disposition. So for example, if you're in the military, it still counts as a non-dismissal and still messes up your military career. Or for Janelle, it would have messed up her DOE status. So when you have an office that is where you are incentivizing the staff members to secure convictions, and you're not incentivizing them to creatively solve problems or address root causes, eventually the people who want to address root causes and come up with creative solutions and do the right thing and like chase that ethical duty to do justice that prosecutors hold, they burn out and they leave because they're getting told again and again and again, you can't do it. I mean, literally, I interviewed a prosecutor for the book who had gone into prosecution because his family had experience with domestic violence and he wanted to do justice. That was a really cool motivation. But again and again and again, he would go to his boss and he'd say, I want to do this for this person, like this person's using, we could get them treatment, we could do this thing. And they would say, this is literally as he recounted it to me, you just want that deal because you're black and so's the defendant. To the point where he was sending his white colleagues into these meetings to ask for deals for him that he didn't think he himself would get permission to do. So would you ask yourself, like, where are the good people going? This is a serious, serious issue in how these incentives are structured. It's not always coming from the top. Sometimes you have a great leader, but they're new to the office and they haven't dealt with that middle management layer that's still pushing down really carceral incentives. And so you still have burnout in the young people who came in to do good and aren't going to succeed there. The people who then succeed there are the people who are willing to maximize convictions. And so you kind of like boil these offices down into like this extract of carcerality. I think the same is true with probation or correctional officers. You know, in probation, when you incentivize people to catch mistakes and impose punishments, the people who don't want to impose punishments have to either be very slick about how they deal with their probationers and not necessarily be too visible to the higher ups, or burn out or change what they do. I talked to people in the book who had their lives changed by, a good parole officer who overlooked something when, in their judgment, it was right to overlook it and give this person a chance to succeed. That's not going to be a job advantage for that parole officer. That's something that parole officer then has to hide that they did. In all of these contexts, if we incentivized evidence-based practices that we know lower crime, we would have totally different tactics. If you said to a prosecutor, you're going to be promoted not based on how many convictions you get this year, but we're giving you like a 10 by 10 block square, and you're responsible for all cases coming from this region, and you will get promoted based on how few incidents there are in that region next year. Suddenly you have all kinds of root cause analysis and creative problem solving and interest in what the evidence tells us actually works to lower crime. But that's why I say it's about incentives.
Okay. There's still some mystery there, but I think it is just the human mystery. I want to talk about our perceptions of crime and safety versus the reality around crime and safety, because I think, as somebody who talks a lot about, not a pure abolitionist, but abolishing systems that people think keep us safe, I think the perspective is often you can either have this punitive system or you can have safe streets, but you can't have both. And I was thinking about that because I grew up in Mill Valley. I went to Old Mill. I got into, this probably same level of mayhem as any other kid. But does Mill Valley, I guess there's a police department. I never saw a police car growing up, although I saw many things that I have subsequently seen Black and brown and poor kids get prosecuted for, which you raised. So I wanted to ask you, because this is something I think a lot about, and you're the only person that has written about it that I know of, about how crime statistics and our sense of what is a bad neighborhood, what is a dangerous neighborhood, are driven not necessarily by the people who live there, but by police and prosecutors, because I thought that was fascinating.
So when we look at crime statistics, we're looking at two things. One is arrest reports, so who got arrested where and when for what, and crime reports, so people who called in and said, hey, something bad happened and I needed help with this. A lot of our statistics are based on the arrest reports. The problem with that is that arrest reports are much more reflective of police policy choices than of actual harm. Because if you put a whole bunch of police in a place, they will find stuff to arrest people for. if you leave a region relatively without police, unless the residents of that region call the police in, you will have a lot of the harm that's getting people arrested in the highly policed area be totally ignored in the unpoliced area. So an example might be, when I was a kid, if I wanted to go to my friend Eva Patil's house, I would go down the street and I would go knock on her door, and if she was home, she could play, and if she wasn't home, then I would go back to my house. By the way, if we were playing, we would run all through the neighborhood. We were going in all kinds of places and yards and cutting through this back, when you're a kid, you know the back way to everywhere, right? But in the Bronx, if my clients went over to their friend's house in a building in the Bronx and went to knock on that apartment door and their friend wasn't home, they would get arrested for trespassing. Because New York at the time had a policy called clean halls, where the NYPD would patrol a building, and unless you could get a resident to say, yes, this person is my guest, you would get arrested for trespassing. That's a big problem if you've gone over to your friend's house to see if they're home and they're not. So as a defender in arraignments, I would have case after case after case of teenagers. And by the way, if you're 16 in New York, you're charged as an adult. So it's, the adult system full of teenagers who are hanging out in places. Personally, as a citizen, I'm not particularly afraid of teenagers hanging out in places. It's not until they do really nefarious things that I get worried. So we're not really solving anything public safety-wise, but the police policy choice had been to concentrate officers in this region on this thing. So kids in one neighborhood are doing, TPing each other's houses, and kids in the other neighborhood are getting arrested for walking through a building. But this means that when we look at our crime statistics, whole areas of crime are rendered invisible. One, there's whatever harm is happening in places where police do not choose to go, and people don't choose to tell them about it. Whatever's happening in Mill Valley, whatever you guys have not told the police about.
It was a long time ago, but there was a lot going on in Mill Valley in the 70s.
I believe you. But there's also categories of crime that get ignored. So for example, wage theft is one of the most prevalent forms of theft in this country. And yet it is almost never prosecuted. If you work at Denny's or Dunkin' Donuts or whatever, and you take money from the till, you are going to get prosecuted for theft. If your boss doesn't put money in your paycheck that he is supposed to, your boss is not going to get prosecuted for wage theft, 9 times out of 10. Environmental crime. There was a huge scandal in California a few years ago where, in a settlement, the California District Attorneys Association was supposed to use a chunk of settlement funding to prosecute environmental crimes. You know what they did with it? They used it to hire lobbyists to fight bail reform. That's because they're not concentrating on environmental crime, and yet environmental crime impacts thousands of people at a time. And it can impact us for generations. It's not time limited. There's also crime that is carried out by police. Obviously, we have a huge conversation right now nationally in this country about what do we do when police harm people overtly in the streets. Can they be prosecuted when they're doing something that is clearly outside the scope of their duty and results in death? But there's also, what do we do when police grope somebody that they're arresting? What do we do about sexual assault? What do we do about police who steal things from crime scenes? None of this is ever getting prosecuted. So there's essentially the crime that we're told about is a reflection of the policy choices of the police in our region. It's not a reflection of the full picture of what crime is actually happening where we live.
Can I share a quick story that speaks to that? Because it's just so, as you were listing the kinds of crime that are not prosecuted, in this particular moment, I kept thinking, and sex trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely.
In my last book, Burning Down the House, which is essentially a reported argument against youth incarceration, I tell a story about a girl who was raped repeatedly by her counselor in a juvenile facility. And I was on the radio telling Dave Davies this story. And I talked about how this was happening in an office, and another guard walked in on it and said, "Oh, sorry," and closed the door and left. And he asked me, "Wait, you're saying that another guard walked in on this girl having sex with a guard and just walked out?" And I had to say, well, he was raping her. They weren't having sex. Yeah. It's a very widespread sort of confusion we have around what constitutes crime, depending on...
An underage woman.
Yes, exactly. That
yeah.
she in captivity. So that kind of takes us to this moment, and I wanted to ask you about that because one phrase that jumped out of your book to me right now is you talk about the dilution of constitutional rights and how our everyday justice system dilutes those constitutional rights. And I think that's a question people are thinking about. So I wanted to ask you, because I know it takes a year or so between submitting a manuscript and coming out and talking about it, you know, how you, like Kavanaugh stops, how do you see us moving nationally in relation to what you've seen at the local level?
Okay, if there's one thing that I convey tonight, I want it to be this. What we are seeing right now at the federal level is the branch of a plant whose roots are in our criminal court system. Here's what I mean. When you want to talk about why the government can get away with sending an official out to speak to Congress or putting out an official statement or making a statement in court and having it be blatantly, provably false, contrary to a video, well, that arises from a system in which testilying which is perjury by law enforcement, by any law enforcement official, is so common. If you ask academics who study it, how common is it? They say it's so common I can't actually quantify it.
That's where Pam Bondi learned it.
But also it's the lack of consequences. So there was a California study where we looked at prosecutorial misconduct, and specifically only cases where there was proven prosecutorial misconduct. Okay, there was a finding that the prosecutor had done something illegal. In those cases, only 0.8% of those prosecutors were ever disciplined. And, sometimes the discipline is like a private reprimand from the state bar, that no one will ever know about. So when you have a world in which about a third of wrongful convictions involve prosecutorial misconduct, but prosecutorial misconduct essentially has no consequence ever, or police lie on the stand all the time. I have been lied to. I'm counting trials in my head. I have had police look me in the eye and lie to me under oath more times than I have not. In almost every trial I've ever done, at some point a police officer has said something provably false to me while under oath. In one case I had a police officer was later uncovered as having framed hundreds of New Yorkers for drug crimes. But sometimes it's little stuff, a suppression hearing. I remember, I'm still mad about this little dumb suppression hearing from 2010. My client was stopped for driving on a suspended license. The reason he was stopped was the officer said he made an illegal turn. I mapped where the officer was at the time my client supposedly made this turn. I went to the location. There is no way a person could see my client from the angle the officer described. And yet the judge, who was also a former police officer, credited this officer's testimony, and my client ended up taking a plea on a suspended license charge, which is not without consequence. The fine, there's all sorts of, so what I'm saying is, when you have a system where these things go unchecked, when you have a system where the Eighth Amendment has been continually weakened by ruling after ruling after ruling that strips away what we consider to be cruel and unusual, or strips away the rights that people have, for example, people who are detained not in the criminal court system, they don't have an Eighth Amendment right. How do you do mass detention of non-criminally accused people in a way where you don't have to really worry at all about the conditions of their confinement? The Eighth Amendment doesn't apply to immigration detention. The 14th Amendment does. There are still due process concerns. But what I'm saying is, if you want to understand this moment, and you also want to address this moment, we can cut off the branches, but until we fix the roots, this stuff is going to keep coming back.
That's okay. This is going to be a strange question, but do you see any hope in that? And yes. the reason I ask that is, Minneapolis, they're shooting the white ladies now, and I think a lot of people are thinking about this stuff who maybe were not thinking about it before because we didn't have to. Like, where are we going? Are we just going into?
Yeah.
Tell me the future.
Okay. So the way I've been framing it in my head is that the scale of our peril is outmatched only by the scale of our opportunity. We are in a moment of national reckoning. This is an object lesson for people in the fact that the government can lie to you and the government can hurt you, and things black and brown people and low-income people have always known in this country. But it's being driven home for a lot of people right now. And I think there is now appetite for change in a way that there was not previously. I mean, when I talk about my subject matter, like neither party nor independents are particularly good on my issues. Like in general, there's a lot of, libertarian Republicans who are kind of okay on it. There's some carceral Democrats who are like Bill Clinton has done some stuff in this. Like the single worst law ever passed was the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act under Bill Clinton. So I've never been able to say like one side gets it, the other doesn't. But right now we're in a moment where everyone across the spectrum is having to get it more than they did before, because there's no avoiding the conclusion that the government has very recently killed people, lied about it, sent people into mass detention, engaged in completely unconstitutional conduct, deceived the tribunal. So for me, as someone who's been screaming this stuff from the rooftops, albeit not with a book as a platform before, day to day in court, or just like telling people and organizing and trying to get folks on board with saying, the guy who tells you you're safe if he can jail more people is not the right guy. Now we're in a moment where I think people are hearing it. So I'm actually very optimistic. I'm very excited about where the next 5 years are going to go. I think it's an opportunity to radically rethink things that have always been a part of us as a nation. People are very good at selling the status quo in this sector. Like anybody who says, I'm going to be tough on crime is telling you, I'm not going to change anything. Right? And so I think we're now at a moment where we're not going to stand for the status quo anymore.
That's a really great point, because as I watch what's unfolding nationally, there's nothing new that's happening, nothing that hasn't happened in the criminal justice world, but it's just all happening everywhere all at once. And so it's visible. But because you answered yes to the question, is there hope? I want to take a few minutes and talk to you about the work you're doing now and some of the solutions that you propose in the book. I have to say the solutions section of your book made me lose my mind, because it's so logical. She's just, but we're not doing it.
No, it's all really doable. Like that's what I wanted people to take away, is that like some of these solutions are just like dead easy dumb stuff.
Just a couple of the common sense things that you will maybe in your children's lifetime will happen.
Yes, but no, here's actually the great thing. Everything happening in the book, for the most part, the solutions is happening somewhere. Like I've been able to find examples of stuff that's tested and is testing really well. Okay, so some examples. One of my favorites is after-school programs. Seems like a small thing. Lowers youth involvement in crime by 50%. Huge drop.
What about trees? That was a really great example.
This is the funny, when I've been talking about the book lately, and this is actually partly due to the Amazon AI summary, where it's like, public defender thinks she can solve crime with trees. Which, like, yes.
You kind of do.
Yes, I do, actually, but it's a little more complicated than that. So research on environmental design and public safety is so exciting. In general, people believe that spaces that are surveilled will be safer. But that's actually not true, because when you're in a space that's a dirty lot with nobody in it and a surveillance camera, you don't know if anybody's watching that camera. You don't know if that camera's even turned on. You can just put on a hat and do some crimes because nobody's in that empty lot with you, right? But if you're in a space that is occupied, if you're in a space where the community likes to spend time, if you're in the public library, if you're in a community garden, if that lot was converted into a community garden and they took down the surveillance camera and they planted some trees and put in some benches, that lot is substantially less likely to experience crime than a place that hasn't had that community investment. The tree piece is really interesting because there are numerous studies on greenery around buildings showing, perhaps intuitively, that buildings with a lot of greenery around them have less property crime. But then and this is, by the way, controlling for socioeconomic factors. This is identical public housing facilities that, like, one has a lot of trees, the other one doesn't. Interestingly, the buildings with more trees also seem to have less domestic violence inside. Do people behave better around trees? I don't actually have an answer on this one, but it's cool because, like much of the environmental design stuff, even if I'm wrong, you've made your neighborhood more beautiful, more livable, and more inviting.
No one's been harmed by that intervention.
And no one's been harmed by the intervention. Yeah. Other ones include, it takes about 17 new police officers to eliminate one homicide. But the city of Philadelphia painted sidewalks, added street lighting, like beautified neighborhoods, and dropped youth homicides by 75%. It's like saving children's lives with paint and lights. LA did a similar thing by turning turning through streets into cul-de-sacs, reduced drive-by shootings because there's no getaway route. And like the general takeaway seems to be people do crimes when they think they're not going to get caught. And if you make spaces where the space, even if it's not occupied at that moment, it feels like a space where someone may arrive momentarily.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Right? Then people are less likely to do crimes there.
So you don't feel alone if there's a tree. And I'm not trying to be funny.
Yeah.
And I think about, my own experience growing up here. I went to Old Mill and I was, a bookish nerd. And every afternoon I walked over to this library and covertly read every book on the young adult rack while looking at trees. And as I think about it, I don't think I was going to commit a lot of crime at that age, but it also stopped me from being a victim of crime. It meant I could be by myself all afternoon and feel really safe. So it makes intuitive sense to me. There's a lot of people here, so I want to make sure that we have time for your questions. I'm just going to ask you one, I think, last question and then open it up to the room. You went from being a public defender, defending individuals, to starting Partners for Justice, which is pioneering a new model for how public defenders could work that you call collaborative defense. And I just wonder if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, with great excitement. So public defenders are at a really great spot in the system for change making because we're upstream. We show up shortly after an arrest has happened, which is the sort of moment of crisis. And we have this legally enshrined confidentiality with our clients, which is quite unique. Like if you're my client, you can tell me whatever you want and I am not gonna snitch on you. Which means if you are struggling, if you fell off the wagon, if you made a terrible mistake, you can tell me, and if I am equipped to deliver aid, then I can help solve that underlying problem without getting you in more trouble. So most of what we do at Partners for Justice is equip public defenders to deliver support with housing, employment, educational access, transportation, mental health support, substance use treatment, like the whole wraparound suite of things that people generally need when they become entangled with the system. And we also train them to write really beautiful mitigation, which is the story you can tell to a judge or a prosecutor that contextualizes a person's behavior and offers a better path forward without prison. We started out small. We started in 2 locations, in Oakland and in Wilmington, Delaware. We hired a bunch of 20-somethings and we trained them to do this work. We are now in over 40 locations across 20 states. Since 2018, we've eliminated nearly 9,000 years of potential incarceration. Thank you. We just did a study with the University of Pennsylvania that showed that having these interdisciplinary collaborative defense specialists in the office increases dismissals and diversions by nearly 50%. And so I think of it as abolition in action, because we just keep proving again and again, person by person, that the punishments weren't necessary after all, and that we could do something better when we connect people with help.
No, that's great. And I have a chapter in my book which is about the really stunning decline in youth incarceration called incremental abolition, because I think that's how it happens. Yeah. We're not going to close a full institution. So that's what you're doing. And
it's pragmatic.
Yeah, and I mean the downstream effects will be really interesting to see. So I want to open it up to you all for questions, comments.
Yeah, I've got the mic and I'm going to come around.
Okay, there's somebody in blue there.
Gotcha.
Hi, my name's Jennifer. I have a kind of a trick question. I appreciate, I haven't read the book yet. My question has to do with California specifically, because I'm not sure about New York or other states, but California has 52 odd counties and 38 or so public defender's offices. Yeah. And
yes.
There's no public defender's office in San Mateo County, which is one of the biggest Bay Area counties, and it was actually, they were sued about 10 years ago because they don't provide defense. Do you have any ideas on how to motivate the government to change structurally to fill those gaps?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, San Mateo County now has a private defender program that is structured. As someone who goes around the country talking to public defenders about how they work and how they're structured, it is the closest I've ever seen a panel system come to institutional defense. It is getting better all the time. I'm a little bit biased because we put client advocates with them to try to build collaborative defense in their office. And it's my experiment in whether collaborative defense can exist in a panel system. If it can exist in any panel system. Panels are systems where there's no institutional defender. It's a network of lawyers who take cases as public defense. And in general, across the country, although most people who live in America have access to an institutional defender because most big cities have them, most of our country geographically is covered by these panel systems, which in my opinion do not work as well as institutional defense, because institutional defense has minimum standards, shared training, like if you have a public defender office, you can hire a bunch of investigators to work with the public defender office, and you can hire trainers to train them, and you have some economies of scale. And you also have, you know, a boss who's checking people's work and letting people go if they don't do a good enough job. In panel systems, the burden is often on the individual practitioner to have all of those things. So, oh, you're a solo practitioner and you're in the panel. Do you have your own investigator? Do you have your own social worker? Do you have your own training? It's really, really hard to expect solo practitioners to have the same level of resourcing as a whole institution. So I think one argument, there's a number of arguments in this vein. One thing is just having excellent counsel actually helps the whole system work better. We see this, a great example of this in housing court. Housing court judges hate how many unrepresented people there are in their courtroom, because it's a mess. If you're a judge and half the people in front of you or more, 90% of the people in front of you are unrepresented and scared and don't know what's going on and really, really stressed and upset, your courtroom is miserable. And in jurisdictions that have brought in the right to counsel in housing court, we see courtrooms running better, cases being managed more efficiently. I think the same thing is really true of excellent institutional defense, where when you do not have a system that imposes such high burdens on struggling solo practitioners, but rather says, we're gonna share resources for everyone, we're gonna share everybody's gonna have investigators, everybody's gonna have social workers, cases can move faster because they are being handled more effectively sooner. Additionally, and this is my preferred argument, public defense is not just an unpleasant constitutional necessity. That's a lot of lawmakers think of public defense as a sort of unpleasant constitutional necessity. Public defense is actually part of our public safety, public health, and economic infrastructure. Here's how. When defenders are able to get someone a treatment outcome instead of a prison sentence, that's a public health intervention. They're deliberately and dedicatedly delivering healthcare services. When you consider that every year of incarceration shaves 2 years off a person's expected lifespan, adds 10 to 15 years to their physiognomy, and 80% of people inside come home with a long-term illness, we also see that preventing prison time is a lot like getting someone to quit smoking, right? Like, it's a health intervention. When you consider that a person's lifetime earnings will be cut in half if they serve a prison sentence, and that American families lose over $300 billion with a B dollars every year due to prior incarceration, you see that a defender who's able to prevent incarceration is changing the local economy, because all of these people are suddenly now not losing half of their projected income, and they're able to keep paying their taxes and shopping at the corner store. When you consider that a defender can get a dismissal that keeps someone's record clean and keeps them employable, that's also an economic intervention. When we look at the social science data that shows that when people have housing, income, and healthcare, they are much, much, much less likely to get arrested. You see that a defender's office that can help people find housing, income, and healthcare is actually lowering future crime. So the second lawmakers click over into this realization that they have been dramatically underutilizing public defense, regarding it as a mandate when in fact it is a huge opportunity to lower public health costs, increase thriving communities, and lower future crime, I think we will see more investment in institutional defense.
Okay, so you're using that rational argument again.
Logic.
Yeah. Who else out there?
Sorry, right here.
Okay. Back in the early, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Back in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, I was in LA, and one of my neighbors was a public defender. She was ecstatic when it turned out that I approved of her job. Is this still the case, that public defenders are
Oh, you mean us public pretenders? us dump truck attorneys? Yeah?
I need to go no further.
I did have a client once tell me, he's like, you're really good. You should think about becoming a lawyer. And I was like, I'm just
Oh my
not
God.
I'm not doing this today.
That should be in the book.
It's happened to everybody. It's not in the book because that has happened to like literally every public defender. Things are changing. There was a time in this country when public defense was perceived as kind of a job you could get if you couldn't get any other job as a lawyer. And now it is perceived as one of the most exciting options for young lawyers.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, we still hear that. We hear that all the time. And I think that's part of the reason why I wanted to write the book, to show people that like the vast majority of folks who are criminally accused either didn't do anything wrong or did something, but like nothing as bad as what they were actually charged with. But also what I'm seeing is, public defense is right now in a little bit of a staffing crisis. Our caseloads have become so high that there's been a huge amount of attrition from our field, and it's really hard to rehire people when caseloads stay so high and the pay is low, and governments do not invest enough in defense. That being said, when I went to law school, I was one of maybe 2 or 3 kids who wanted to be a public defender. And now when I teach in a law school, 2/3 of my class want to be public defenders and are becoming public defenders.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What do you think changed? That great TV show about public defenders.
Oh, it was with Zach from Saved by the Bell?
No, I'm joking. I can't think of a TV show. I can think of a TV show about every other.
It was I don't know. I love some Mark Paul Gosselaar, but I don't know about that one. I think that what changed was this became a liberatory movement, and it became akin to civil rights lawyering. I mean, public defenders are the greatest champions of our Constitution. Every time we protect someone's rights, we're not just protecting them for our one client, we're protecting them for everybody. And I think that realization has really sunk in. I think California has led the way in increasing pay for public defenders. And, not enough. I saw your face. But like when I tell you what they make in the South or in the, in the Midwest or on the East Coast, it's hair raising. I think that over time, the defender community has become incredibly strong at delivering training in a way that previously, young lawyers did not perceive. They perceived it as something that has happened to a lot of people I know, which is you start on the job, they hand you a cardboard box full of cases, and they say, good luck. But that's less and less the case now. There are more and more defender agencies that have trial training programs that send people for real involved training. So I think that we do need to solve our caseload and our funding crisis, but the will and the desire and the vision of defense as a profoundly honorable pursuit is culturally now present.
That's really heartening.
Right here.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for showing up here. Just a quick background. When I was 12, I was in Rockland Children's Psychiatric Center. I grew up in the Catskills. And then maybe 17, I was incarcerated first time in Sullivan County Jail. I've been out here for about 3 years. I have many trips in the last 2 years to the Santa Venetia Sheriff Land, the Marin County Jail, and 2 trips to Sonoma. In fact, one of my lawyers, a public defender, is here tonight. I saw her coming in. I had a question around compulsory psychiatric medication. Because when I was in Pennsylvania one time, I didn't know it was possible, but all of a sudden, I ended up through behavior. I had a thing in Binghamton, and it was a misdemeanor case. But my behavior, I got into it in Binghamton, and it was rough. I'll leave that alone. But I ended up going to what is a criminal insane asylum. It's a middle security prison, Waymart it's called. I did 2 trips there. And there was the first time that I did not have the right to not take meds. You either take it orally there or you take it intravenously, but you don't refuse. Everybody there is taking something because even inside incarceration systems, there has to be rules, and that's where it ended up. So it was prison guards, and then it had a regular middle security prison, but this area was prison guards, in the 4 corners of it, and then the rest. But I was out here, and it was concerning because I had never seen it in the jailhouse of any that I've been. I've been to a few. And then I've seen it openly done now in Sonoma twice, and then openly done in the public yard. I mean, I was in the hole, and then different things given. And it's a weird issue around
I think you're
whether
asking-
someone is allowed to, whether someone is fit for trial, right? Understands what's going on. I had two things I passed them, and I wanted to know your opinion about what do you do about this problem of, this very difficult problem, I would say, of whether someone is fit for trial or not, having that. I passed two of them. My lawyer here had the second one. I told her I already passed it. She was well-intended, but I passed the second one. But some people cannot pass it. So then Sonoma is having a program with it, and then this compulsory action, which was very hard for me to see, and a very difficult issue about whether someone understands what is right or wrong
have
and
you
what
run
it
into
is,
that
what you can
in-
do about that.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult issue. And it's something that I want to note is becoming a really big problem in juvenile detention spaces, where there have been very credible allegations of juvenile detention facilities forcibly medicating children in order to make their own jobs easier, not in a way that's responsive to the children's
I mean, I've
needs.
seen that.
You've
I've
seen
seen
this.
them.
You've written it.
They
Yeah.
kids lined up for the med cart that comes every night.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also I'm sorry, but put in solitary for declining to take their meds was
Yeah.
a big issue in the California Youth Authority here.
And there was a huge issue nationally with the use of Risperdal and Seroquel, which are very heavy antipsychotic medications, being inappropriately imposed upon children. The system gives itself license to take away people's physical autonomy. And once a person is in that space, it is incredibly difficult to escape that space. One thing that I'm very proud that public defenders I've worked with have been assigned to do is to defend people in civil commitment context. So civil commitment is the process through which the state can take away a person's right to be their own guardian, essentially, even if they haven't committed a crime or even after they've already served their sentence for a crime. With the issue of competency, it can be really challenging. It is good to ensure that people are able to participate in their own defense. I have sometimes had clients who were not present in the same reality as me at that time and not able, they didn't know who I was or who the judge was or what was happening around them. And it would be horrifying to continue to prosecute somebody who is not able to meaningfully participate in their own defense. That being said, in a system which normalizes the stripping of bodily autonomy, it is terrifying to send someone into a space where the state has been given a mandate to restore that person to competency through whatever means it deems best. By the same token, we have, a sort of the Janus coin of this problem, is that when people are admitted to jails in this country, generally the jail will not honor their medication regimen. So if a person has crucial medications, there was a man a few years ago who died in a jail because he was not given an anti-rejection medication for an organ transplant. Jails want to re-diagnose and re-prescribe everybody who comes through. So for me as a defender, I might have someone who is taking a urgently needed mental health medication, and if they went without it for a period of time, they were going to decompensate and become very unwell. And it was their medication that they chose to take with their doctor, and the jail would deny them that medication. I mean, I remember literally listing medications on the record to try to make a record in front of the judge. This is what this person is taking. They need to be sent to jail. If you're gonna hold them, asking you to release them, but if you are gonna hold them, you are responsible for maintaining their healthcare regimen. And again, I would meet with my clients a few days later, and they would not have been given what they needed, and they would be very, very sick. And then, of course, you have to ask yourself, who is responsible for incompetency now? It's not my client who had a perfectly suitable plan that was working well for them. At that point, it becomes the jurisdiction, which has stripped that person of their wellness and now seeks to impose its own treatments upon them. So I want to honor your question by saying I don't have a smart answer that fixes it right now. What I do have is to go back to this idea of culture and incentives. If we were incentivizing people who worked in the system to prioritize wellness, long-term good outcomes, low incidence of harm inside jails, as opposed to rewarding people for violent enforcement and sort of like quelling dissent among others, we would have different tactics that were used. And so I think it's really a culture problem and an incentives problem.
You said something that really just kind of lit up for me. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing accurately, but that the essence of incarceration is the removal of bodily autonomy. And it just, that really struck me because we don't frame it as a bodily autonomy issue, but you do lose, you know, in the youth authority, girls are constantly coming up pregnant. And it used to be that when you became pregnant, and there aren't any boys in the institution, so there's not any mystery about how it's happening, they would put you in a pink jumpsuit so that everyone would know you were pregnant and all the other girls would know what was happening. In any case, that's a really interesting take on it. I think we have time for just one more question.
Yeah,
Yikes.
thank you so much. And just a reminder, there's going to be some time for a book signing afterwards. So if your questions didn't get answered, you should buy a book and stand in the line. But last question, let's see right here in the front.
Thank you for all your positivity and all your work, both of you. So in the context of your book, Unfair Trials, A Violent System, Unfair Arrests, discrimination, all that stuff that, we all know is happening, right? And like you're talking about, how the change has to start from the roots up. At what point do we start to see that shift when we know that the prison population in this country has exploded in the 80s and 90s by design? Yeah. It became, 25% of the world's incarcerated by design. Yeah. The economy of prisons are not just private. Yeah. Public prisons are the majority of prisons, and they provide employment, right? And so how do we, I love that you're hopeful, and I'm hopeful by nature, but like when I see the explosion of incarceration, and it's not coming down as far as I know from
It
2
is.
point.
It
Is
is
it coming down?
It has come down significantly.
Okay, from 2.2 to...
Yes, it's now like 1.8 or something. I'd have to look. It has come down substantially. And I want to point out that at this point, the fastest growing form of incarceration in America is immigration detention. Now, private prisons were never the problem in criminal detention. As you point out quite astutely, the profit motive inside the carceral system goes so far beyond core civic and geo group, who are now, of course, saving their own skins and making money hand over fist by having shifted over into immigration detention. It's in the phone companies, it's in the commissary companies, it's in the tablet companies who are now pushing detention facilities to disallow in-person visitation, which, by the way, we know not only helps people when they return because they maintain their social networks, but lowers violence in prisons because people who have visits are less likely to engage in violence. They're trying to force all visits to be virtual on tablets, so you have to pay. They're trying to remove the right for people to have in-person or physical mail so that you can hold the object your loved one touched and put a photo of your daughter up on your wall. They want that all to be sent to Florida, scanned, and then delivered virtually for pay in a way that you cannot physically keep. There's a movement right now called the Right to Hug, which is about pressuring lawmakers to pass legislation mandating that facilities never be allowed to cancel in-person visitation in favor of tablets, that they not give in to the tablet companies' profit motives, but rather that you should always have the right to hug your children. So my answer to you is, first of all, there's a great org called Worth Rises that I recommend you all look at, that is it's focusing on stripping the profit motive out of the carceral system. But another thing we can do is hold lawmakers accountable. Tens of millions of dollars are pouring from correctional officers unions, police unions, prosecutors unions towards lawmakers. And lawmakers have this luxury of, in many jurisdictions, having excised a huge quantity of their voting public via felony conviction. Because, of course, we're one of the only countries that conditions your rights of citizenship on your behavior. In other countries, voting is an absolute right of citizenship. For us, we can take it away. And that's why in some jurisdictions you have 1/3 of voting age men, and 1/3 of voting age black men not being able to vote. So suddenly you have lawmakers who are not super worried about this constituency because they've been removed from having a voice, and they're getting a ton of money from private interests that profit off of incarceration. We can hold them accountable for that. We can look up how much money they receive from these correctional officers unions, Victims United in California, which is not actually a crime victims organization, it's a correctional officers union, right? How many times have you been asked to go to the ballot box and vote for somebody and they have like a D or an R or an I next to their name and you have no idea what they stand for because they are a local criminal justice role and they haven't been pressured to provide you with a platform? We can put an end to that garbage by calling the paper and saying, hey, this person's running for judge or sheriff and I don't know what they stand for and I'm mad about that and it's your job to tell me. And then we can ask them hard questions about who they support and what their plans are. So is upskilling an entire prison town so that they can find employment outside of the prison a quick process? No. but it is one that we can continue this momentum on. We've already seen a decline in population. We've also seen a decline in racial inequity within the system, which is very interesting. Right now, there's one study that I have in the book that suggests the biggest driver of inequity currently is education, not race, which is a wild change if that's the case. So yeah, it's not a simple thing, but we have to start holding them loudly accountable.
Thank you so much. I learned as much as I did from reading the book, from
thank you for
speaking.
the
Thank you so much, Emily and Nell.
Okay.